Okay, today we're going to give Petite Orange Vanilla Scones a try. I've never made scones before, so we're going to do this together. Here is your list of ingredients. Okay, I've added the 1 3/4 cups of flour, and then you're going to need to leave some out because you're going to need to dust your surface later. And then we have to add 1/4 cup of granulated sugar. And I talked before about I would rather cook than bake a lot because baking is a little more precise science. So if you're measuring out flour, you're measuring out sugar, just don't dump it in. You're going to need to level off your measuring cups before you put that in. Same thing with your dry ingredients. Then you need 2 teaspoons of baking powder. And I know I almost put baking soda in something else the other day. See, that's nice and leveled off. Put 2 of those in there. And 2 teaspoons of baking powder. And then it calls for 1/4 teaspoon of kosher salt. Make sure that's leveled off nice. And then you're going to mix those together. And then you're going to need to take 4 tablespoons of cold salted butter, and then we're going to cut into small pieces because we need to mix that into here. So it said to take 4 tablespoons of cold salted butter, which is 1/2 stick, and you're going to want to cut that up into pieces. So I'm going to cut them up just definitely nice and cold. I try not to touch the butter too much if I can with my hands because my hands are always warm. And then when it says cut it into small pieces, I'm going to cut each piece into 4. And I'm going to throw it in here, which I just remembered I did not mix this up, which I want to have it nice and mixed. Then cut your butter up and get your butter into your pan, into your bowl. And then you're going to want to cut your butter into that. And what that means, if you have a pastry blender, that's going to probably work the best for you. But if you do not have a pastry blender, you can take 2 knives, butter knives, and I'll show you how to do that in a second. Let me finish cutting this butter and I'll show you. Okay, if you do not have a pastry blender that looks like this, then take 2 knives and you kind of put your thumb between them and you start cutting your butter into your mixture. But since I have a pastry blender and it'll work a little bit quicker, I am going to use my pastry blender, and then you just continue to move it around and cut it into your flour. And you want to continue this process until it resembles sort of coarse crumbs, and I'll show you what that looks like when it's done. Your butter begins to get stuck into your pastry blender like this. Grab a knife and just scrape it, and sometimes you have to scrape in between the tines of your pastry blender. And then you just go back to working it into a coarse crumble. This is getting to the texture of a coarse crumbs, but I am actually using my hands to actually rub it in a little bit more because sometimes that works a little bit better. And then I'll take my pastry blender through it one last time. Okay, now that's come to a coarse crumble. Looks kind of like crumbs. And next you want to take a medium-sized bowl and add into it 1/2 cup of heavy cream. And then you are also going to add 1/2 teaspoon of vanilla extract and 1 large egg. My egg. And then I don't have extract, so I'm using imitation vanilla. I'm going to use 1/2 teaspoon of that. And then you're going to whisk them together to start. And we're also going to add in that zest from the orange. sure I get all that zest in there. And this is going to get whisked together. And then what we're going to do is we're going to add this to our flour mixture, but I'm going to get my spatula again. And get the rest of the cream out of here. I'm going to need that spatula when we mix it in. So whisk that all together. And then we're going to pour it into the dry mixture. And then we're going to want to take a fork and gently stir this mixture until it just comes together. Forgot to grab my fork, so we're just going to gently stir this. When they say until it just comes together, meaning when all of your wet flour mixture has become moistened. Then what we're going to do is we're going to turn this out onto a floured surface so that we can roll it out. So I think we're almost there. We've got a little bit on the bottom that we need to pull up, but it's just starting to come together. All right, so I'm going to prepare my surface and then we'll get it taken care of. Okay, the next step is to turn it out onto a lightly floured surface, and you want to get it into a rough rectangle. After that is into a rough rectangle, you're going to want to take your rolling pin, and I'm going to get a little more flour across the top so that my rolling pin doesn't stick to it. And you want to make it so that it gets into about a 6 by 8 inch rectangle that is approximately a 1/2 inch thick. It's definitely larger than a 6 by 8 inch rectangle. What you're going to want to do is grab a knife, it says, and then you're going to cut it lengthwise in half, and then quarter the crosswise to make 8 pieces. And then you're going to cut each of those pieces in half diagonally, so you should have 16. All right, I'm cutting them this way and then quartering them. And then we want to cut these into triangles. I believe I may have said rectangles before. Then I'm just going to lay them and arrange them on my baking pan. And these are small because they're Petite orange scones. And obviously these are going to look like they're a little bit different sizes. These are going to be a tad bit bigger. And then we are going to bake them until they're lightly browned on the bottom, so for approximately 15 minutes. And then we're going to let them cool for 15 minutes. And while we're baking them, we are going to get the glaze mixed together. All right, I don't know how much these are going to puff up. I've never made scones before, but let's pop them in the oven and see what they look like when they come out. Okay, I did not read through all of the instructions and realize that you needed to have 2 oranges to complete this, because you needed the zest of 1 orange for the scones and you needed the zest of the another orange for the actual glaze that goes on top. So for the glaze, you're going to take 1 cup of, it's known as confectioner's sugar or powdered sugar, and then it said the juice of 1 orange, and you can just squeeze the orange if you'd like. Just give it a nice little squeeze and get all that juice from 1 orange into, almost looks like a grapefruit. I'm going to use a little bit of my little lemon That's what I usually use to do a lemon. It actually looks like a grapefruit, doesn't it? Anyway, so we have that in there, and then it says to also put in a quarter of a teaspoon of vanilla extract. So we'll put that in there, if I can get some out. And then it says to whisk this all together until it's nice and smooth. And then when you're, let's put the zest. Anyway, what I said, I ran out of, I only brought one orange, so I grabbed a couple of my little tangerines that I had, and I added those in there. And now you'll have a nice glaze. So when your scones come out of the oven, you're gonna put those on a rack after and cool for about 15 minutes on that baking sheet. And then we're gonna remove them to the rack to completely cool. And then we'll take care of it from there, and I'll show you what we're gonna do. Okay, my timer just went off. So it looks like they're completely browned on the bottom, but we're gonna just take a peek. Yep, they look browned on the bottom, so we're gonna pull them out of the oven. Says to allow them to sit on the baking sheet for 15 minutes, then to remove them to the rack and allow them to completely cool. And let's take a peek. They're hot, but yep, they're nice and brown on the bottom, so we're gonna let them sit here for about 15 minutes. They are cooled. You're gonna take your scones and you're gonna just dip the tops very lightly to glaze them, and then put them back on the rack to get solid. Sorry, family's all here. It's kind of loud today. Bit of advice: you might want to put some wax paper down, because as you can see, mine dripped all over, even on my counter before I realized. So I put some wax paper underneath there.